Welcome back, fellow football fanatics. It's College Football with Sam, and man, I stumble over my own words because there's a lot to digest from Week 14. And it's also been a long time since we've been live here. But I'm bringing back live streams because they're easier on me. I also think many of you enjoy them. And it's just a very, very good way of getting all of my thoughts at once. And then if you don't have the time to watch the entire live stream, you can watch the cut-up snippets that I will relieve in the 24 to 48 hours following my live streams. So today we're talking about Michigan versus Ohio State and the absolute insanity that was. Also, we'll talk about Notre Dame versus USC. We'll discuss Nebraska versus Iowa and the Cornhuskers choking away what should have been another easy win. We will discuss Oregon, Penn State, and Indiana punching their ticket to the college football playoff. And by the way, just before we begin here and really dive into these topics, we'll also be talking about Ryan Day and his job security and just his position really at Ohio State. We will not be reading super chats, during every live stream. We won't. It just interrupts the flow. But every super chat that you donate, I will answer said super chat. If it's in the format of a question, I will answer it in a question and answer session that we will be doing weekly here on College Football with Sam. That's something that I'm planning on doing. That way I can answer your super chats. Your question can be featured in a video. It will be released in video format. And yeah, that way I answer your questions and it doesn't interrupt the flow of the show. So I just wanted to shoot that out there, but let's dive in. Let's get into it. Thank you, Armand, for being in the chat. Joe B for being in the chat. We'll talk about a lot of these things that happened in Week 14. Make sure before you forget, because I know many of you probably think you're already subscribed or you know that this is coming. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like the video as well. Hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we go live here. Share the video around. We will be doing a giveaway at the end of the regular season, sometime in between the end of conference championship week and the first round of the college football playoff games. I will be doing a giveaway to celebrate us reaching 20,000 subscribers. Our new goal is 30,000 subscribers. So if you can help us do that by sharing the video around, a live show, the channel, subscribing, hitting the bell, liking, commenting, being active in the chat and also in the comment section, and joining our Discord server. That's something that you can do as well. Just click the link in the description, open up that description, the live description, and join via the Discord server link. It's clearly labeled. We talk college football 24/7 there, and you will not want to miss that. But again, we will be doing a giveaway very, 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 very soon, in the middle of December, approximately. So thank you for your patience, for your support, and let's get right in. I want to talk about Michigan, and I want to talk about Ohio State, and I want to talk about the insanity of that game. Let me preface this entire conversation by saying that I did not think that Michigan had any chance of winning. Any. Like, no chance whatsoever. I thought that Michigan was going to get totally destroyed, and they didn't. So Michigan versus Ohio State was the most crazy game. It was the craziest game of the year. The Michigan Wolverines upset the Ohio State Buckeyes by a score of 13-10 in a low-scoring, pre-21st century, all-time rivalry classic. It is probably the worst loss that Ohio State has suffered, not just in the 21st century, but probably in its entire history. Am I thinking of that right? Or am I way off base there? I don't think I'm off base there at all. This was a terrible loss where Ohio State looked disheveled, they looked disorganized, they looked insecure, they lacked confidence, they lacked adaptability, they lacked football IQ. They really, and I mean that, they really lacked football IQ, and it was apparent in this matchup. This offense has been touted for week after week after week as being one of the nation's best. This team has been touted by power ratings and people who closely follow power ratings as the nation's best team. They got embarrassed on their own field. They got jolted. They got kicked in the mouth. They got punched in the mouth. Their teeth fell out. They were defanged. They were neutered by a team that was 6-5, 4-4 in conference play, and is still outside the top 110 in scoring offense, and not even top 20 in scoring defense. This was a terrible loss, and something I said in my preview for this game is that the only way Michigan was winning was by divine intervention, was something spiritual, metaphysical, something that didn't relate to college football, to the sport. And in truth, that's exactly what happened, because the game plan that Ohio State called was outer worldly. It was insane. It was the worst game plan that you could come up with in the week leading up to what is your biggest game of the year. I don't know what to tell you outside of that. I mean, Ohio State had only 252 total yards. They had 2 turnovers, 16 first downs. They only had 26 minutes and 25 seconds of possession. I mean, you want a statistic here that is important, or a couple of impact statistics. OSU was held to 175 passing yards, 5.3 yards per pass attempt, 1 touchdown, and 2 horrific picks. Horrific. My movement of my head, the movement of my body, the way I said horrific. It's not an exaggeration. Those were some of the worst throws that I have seen an Ohio State quarterback make. It looked like Will Howard was trying to throw it to the defensive backs and not the receivers that he was targeting. 5.3 yards per carry against a secondary that Texas and Oregon casually owned. Aiden Childs did better against this secondary than Will Howard did, without even 1/1000th of the supporting cast and no home field advantage. Same thing with Luke Altmaier. Same thing with Will Rogers. I mean, you look at this game right here, and the fact that Ohio State was held to 10 points by Wink Martindale, it's beyond humiliating, because Fresno State scored 10 points. Texas scored 31. Arkansas State scored 18. USC scored 24. Minnesota did too, 24. Washington scored 27. Illinois 21. Michigan State 17. Oregon 38. Indiana 20. Only Northwestern scored fewer points than Ohio State did, and at least Northwestern could make their field goals. Ohio State could not. Every single weakness that I personally had been harping on for months. It's why I picked Ohio State to lose to Penn State, to lose to Indiana. That's why. The same issues that I thought would come up in those games came up all at once in what is Ohio State's biggest game of the year. Was it a top 5 matchup like Indiana and Penn State? No. But it's the game. It's the rivalry. And Michigan was a 20.5-point underdog and won. There is already a Wikipedia section, a Wikipedia series of paragraphs, an essay in the section about the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry, naming this game the upset. This is humiliating for Ryan Day and Ohio State. And I've said that over and over again, and we're going to say it over and over again, because we're spending about half of this show, hour and 30 minutes, talking about it. It deserves to be talked about. It's horrible. Horrible. Michigan's offense looked exactly like it did all year, and they won. Their defense early on looked inept in stopping the pass, but Ohio State didn't attack the pass attack. They wanted to run. Well, the problem was, after a while, Michigan figured out they could stop Ohio State's rushing attack by only bringing 4, by only using their defensive line. They gave Wink Martindale ages to adapt, and by the time he finally adapted, it was over. Ohio State couldn't pass the football either, in the same way that they couldn't run. Think of Ohio State's only real drive in the fourth quarter, where Jack Sawyer had that amazing interception. Phenomenal. He should be the defensive MVP for that alone, for both teams. Phenomenal pick. Looked like he saved OSU's season, but he didn't, because Ohio State ran the ball on the outside, got lucky that wasn't a play for a loss. Henderson made it into a 5-yard gain because he's awesome. And then I forget what happened on the 2nd and 5, but I think it was an incomplete pass. And then 3rd and 5, or maybe it was a run. It may have been I think it actually may have been a run for no gain. But then 3rd and 5, it's obviously a passing down because Ohio State can't run the football. Will Howard drops back. He has all right protection. It does break down eventually, but he can't get anything downfield because at that point Michigan's adapted. Your receiver advantage was lost because now Michigan has figured out that they can drop 7 into coverage compared to the 5 players or 4 that you have downfield trying to catch the football. Michigan fixed their weakness because you refused to exploit it, and you were so bad at trying to move Michigan off the point of attack that Michigan didn't care to even defend the run. They knew they could do it with only 4. Ohio State only finished with 77 rushing yards. They averaged 3 yards per carry. And this is even more humiliating. They scored 0.169 points per play. And again, they lost the TOP battle. Michigan had 33 minutes, 35 seconds of possession. They had like a 7-minute possession advantage, which is killer in a game where you are throwing picks in the opponent's red zone, where you're missing your field goals. I mean, if Ohio State just makes their field goals, they win. If Will Howard doesn't throw that pass to Makari Page, they probably go into overtime and win. Maybe it's not a guarantee because of the fact they were missing field goals, but Jaden Fielding did make a field goal early. It's not like he was completely incapable of making a field goal. Just what an utter disaster. And again, Michigan didn't play this amazing game. Defensively, they played a great game. They were great on the offensive line, but Warren was 9 of 16 for 62 yards. He threw 2 terrible interceptions, one right to Caleb Downs, the other right to Jack Sawyer. Michigan's leading receiver was Peyton O'Leary with 1 reception for 18 yards. And Kalel Mullings, Michigan's leading rusher, 32 carries, 116 yards, 3.6 yards per carry. Him and Alex Orji had 2 runs for 56 yards out of 41 carries for 173. So Michigan ran the ball and ran it on an aggregate basis at an all right, okay level against what is a good Ohio State rush defense. But those 2 rushing plays really made the difference, especially Kalel Mullings' long of 27, where it's 3rd and 5, breaks a ton of tackles, shows that he has more effort and more will than Ohio State's defense, which is tired because it's the middle of the fourth quarter, and Ohio State's defense has already been on the field for 6 or 7 minutes. It's not a good sign. And he gets Michigan into field goal range. That was the play that ended up winning the game for the Wolverines. It's just insanity. That's the only word that can describe what took place yesterday afternoon in the Horseshoe, in Ohio Stadium, in Columbus. So let's talk about Michigan here and why they won, and then we'll get to Ohio State. And then after we talk about Ohio State, we'll talk about Ryan Day. And yeah. Ryan Day is definitely feeling it right now. But again, topic for later. So you look at this matchup here, and entering this game, the only area where Michigan had an edge was their defensive line versus Ohio State's offensive line. And maybe if they could do enough through the air, and if they played their A game up front, maybe their offensive line and their running back room against Ohio State's D-line and linebackers, maybe they could make something happen in the rushing offense. The difference between Michigan and Ohio State in this game, and why Michigan won, the only reason why Michigan won, is because Michigan did what it had to do to win, while Ohio State was trying to prove a point. Ohio State was not trying to win a battle or win a war. They were trying to win an argument. They were committed to a ritual. Michigan was committed to the actual war. They had 41 carries for 173 rushing yards, 4.2 yards per carry, one rushing touchdown. And Michigan, I know that Michigan barely passed the football. Meanwhile, Ohio State passed it for more. Michigan earned 21 pressures. And especially as the game progressed, when Will Howard was dropping back to pass because Michigan was figuring out Ohio State's offense the longer the game went on, he didn't have much time to throw. I mean, his offensive line was not just failing in the ground game where, like I said in the preseason, they have no depth there. One injury, they're dead. Well, they've suffered 2 injuries to their best offensive lineman, and this unit's a wreck. And we'll talk about that later. But in the pass blocking, oh man, at the end of the game, that 4th and 9 play was the epitome of Ohio State's offensive line. They did not give Howard time enough to throw, or enough time to throw. Pardon that mix-up of words. And speaking of a mix-up, Will Howard was throwing it to Henderson anyway, who was 9 yards behind the first down marker and was going to get tackled. Just total dysfunction. And that's both the fault of Ryan Day and Chip Kelly, but also you got to give Michigan credit there because Michigan did not lay down and die. I mean, Michigan, for example, was 7 of 14 on 3rd down. That's insane. That is a statistic that I bet you no one expected for Michigan to convert half of their 3rd down attempts. Half of them. Many of them through the air. Some of them on the ground, even in longer situations. Mind-boggling. And Michigan did what they had to do to win. They put themselves in the best position to win, schematically. Obviously, 2 interceptions in a game this close against an opponent like Ohio State who outmatches you is not ideal, but it didn't matter because Ohio State also had 2 interceptions, and they basically had 2 more turnovers on downs with the missed field goal and an additional turnover on downs at the end of the game. I mean, Ohio State basically turned away 5 drives that could have been scores for them, or at least flipping the field and making it harder for Michigan to score. Ohio State was constantly shooting itself in the foot, not just player-wise and player performance, but also schematically. Michigan's players all year have shot themselves in the foot. That was no surprise that happened Saturday. But what was a surprise is that for the most part, schematically, they did not shoot themselves in the foot. They did what was necessary to win. And they led in the rushing battle, 173 rushing yards and 4.2 yards per carry for Michigan. And that is in strong juxtaposition to an Ohio State rushing attack that had only 77 total yards, 3 yards per carry. It's the 5th game this season where Quinshon Judkins has averaged fewer than 4 yards per carry. Michigan, Purdue, you look at Indiana, you look at Nebraska, you look at Oregon. Just what are they doing? What is Ohio State's offensive line coach, their strength and conditioning coach, and Chip Kelly and Ryan Day? What are they doing? What are they doing? And Quinshon Judkins is an awesome running back. I don't think this is on him. If you were not going to build a great offensive line and scheme, then why did you bring him at all? You may as well have gotten another wide receiver or a tight end or someone who does not rely on what is in front of him to win, because that's the reality of running backs. Your offensive line is a big part of your success, bigger than almost any other position on offense. Just why? Michigan, meanwhile, Kalel Mullings went from being a linebacker to being able to run for over 100 yards and do things on the ground, in part because of his offensive line, which it wasn't just Michigan's D-line that owned Ohio State up front. It was the O-line as well. The Wolverines were the tougher team, make no mistake about it. I mean, they gave up 2 turnovers, and they were 0-1 on 4th down, and that was a run. It was a very physical play by Ohio State's defensive line. And they had 4 penalties for 50 yards, Michigan did. One of which was at the end and unsportsmanlike, so that really doesn't matter. But they never, ever quit. I mean, think about it. You get all the way down the field, and then you get stopped on 4th and 1. Like Ohio State questions and pushes you around physically. They question your identity. You don't give up. Davis Warren throws a dumb interception inside of his own 20. The defense doesn't cave. Davis Warren throws another bad interception to a defensive end of all people, and the stadium erupts. Your defense doesn't give up. It's 3rd and 5. You run a stretch play. Ohio State doesn't blow it up, but they get enough penetration and read it well enough to where they should have stopped it and forced Michigan to make a decision of whether to kick the field goal or to go for it. Your running back doesn't give up. He breaks tackles and gets a 27-yard gain and basically seals it, barring some type of disaster that hadn't happened for Michigan's defense all day. The Wolverines were the tougher team. They had the better mentality. They had the better coaching. They executed better relative to their overall season performance, relative to their potential. And they had to face a hostile crowd. And they didn't false start once, I don't believe. They didn't. They were disciplined. They were the more disciplined team. They weren't the better team, but on that day, they played the better game, and they worked their opponent, and they got in Ohio State's head. It was very clear when it was 4th and 7, Ohio State was like past the Michigan 40, or at least past the 50. 4th and 7, a similar play happened against Indiana the week prior where it was 4th and 10. Ohio State goes for it. They convert, and that's really where the momentum swung in Ohio State's direction. This time against Michigan, they punt. They punt. They go from being completely aggressive the prior week to very conservative this week. And that's because the game means a whole lot, and Ryan Day's lost it 3 times, and he doesn't want to lose it a 4th. But it's also because Michigan's defense this Saturday was stingy enough, and the offense was controlling the game enough to where Ryan Day was so scared of giving Michigan any chance at momentum, where he in fact surrendered the momentum. That's the cost of being too conservative, and it can be the cost of being too aggressive as well. You want to have a balanced approach. Ohio State was already being as conservative as possible in this game, and the fact that they weren't aggressive in that moment when, they had driven down the field, taken 5 minutes of clock, your defense is rested. If you fail in the 4th and 7, you can probably force Michigan to punt again, but instead they punt it to Michigan. It was strange, if I'm being honest. It was very, very strange, and it reeked to me of insecurity and of something that you don't want to see if you're an Ohio State fan or if you're an Ohio State player. It was kind of weak. And it wasn't advantageous at all. If you're advantageous and you want to pounce on an opponent, especially one that's very limited, you go for it on that 4th and 7 with Will Howard and the receivers that you have. But Michigan, they were aggressive, they were tactical, and they were tougher. They were mentally and physically tougher. To go into the horseshoe and win as that big of an underdog with that much limitations, or so many limitations at different positions, is impressive. So credit to Sharon Moore, Kurt Campbell, even though he won't have a job at Michigan, at least as the OC next year. Wink Martindale, even though that may apply to him as the defensive coordinator. Kudos to the staff. Kudos to these players, the veterans, the young players. Davis Warren, he finishes with an undefeated record against Ohio State. It's the same thing with Alex Orji. It's the same thing with Jaden Denegal. It's the same thing with, Kalel Mullings, with Donovan Edwards. Hopefully he heals up. Don't like to see injuries. You hate to see him. And consequentially, no player on Ohio State's roster right now has beaten Michigan. None. Not even Caleb Downs, who played him in the Rose Bowl. And no player on Michigan's roster that I know of has lost to Ohio State, either in their prior career at a different school or with Michigan, for sure. They haven't lost to Ohio State. So speaking of this, before we get to the Buckeyes, is there optimism for the future? Is Michigan on the rise? Or was this loss more about Ohio State and their weaknesses? I think it's a bit of both. I think that this game showed that Sharon Moore can put together a competent game plan, but it also showed that Ohio State has a lot of weaknesses, and that a lot of what I was told, a lot of what you were told, and a lot of stuff that you and I collectively believed in about Ohio State was kind of a lie and was not real, was kind of fugazi, kind of faux, fake. Again, we'll get into that here. But Underwood committed to Michigan. Michigan's recruiting class is easily top 10 right now, could be top 5 at the end of the year. NIL is flooding into the program. Money is flooding into the program. They just beat their biggest rival, and they beat Michigan State early in the season. And yes, they have a lot of talent from last year, which could have carried them, but they're ending the regular season, bless me, on a high note. So what does Michigan do with that? And is there optimism for the future? I think there's a lot of optimism for the future. And I think 2025, the schedule Michigan has next season is very workable, very easy. It's from a very early preseason point of view, so things could change. But there's a lot of opportunity next year and in the future for Michigan to rise back to national prominence. And while they're not a part of the national picture for this individual year, in a broad sense, they are. And Saturday showed that. I mean, everyone's talking about Michigan right now. Michigan, their preseason win total was what, 8.5, 9.5? They're going under there. And I still think that Michigan's season is actually a failure. It's just not as big of a failure now that Michigan achieved the greatest upset in the history of the game, the greatest rivalry in college football. And there will be more to talk about in regards to Michigan, but comment your thoughts down below. What do you think Michigan's outlook is as a program? Do you think that they can quickly rise back to being an elite program? Do you think there's hope with Sharon Moore? I'm not talking about the staff because I think there will be major staff changes. What do you think about Michigan football? That'll, again, be a topic for a different video. But I can tell you what I think about Ohio State football in the here and now and also long term. In the here and now, their game plan was insane. It was ridiculous. You pass 33 times, only 7 more times than you run, and you put up 252 total yards with NFL players, specifically at the wide receiver position. What are you doing? Chip Kelly, Ryan Day. I mean, how did this go? Because Chip Kelly calls the plays, and he has all season long, but how did these plays at the end of the game go through Ryan Day's headset, and he just let it happen? I don't know what to tell you. I'm speechless there. If you haven't figured out already, and if you follow the channel, you do, because I'm honest about it, I am a Michigan fan. And I was watching this game, and I could not believe what I was watching. The last thing you want to do, if you are an opponent of Michigan, is spam halfback dive and inside zone against this team. That is how you give Michigan's defense confidence. It's how you get Michigan's crowd excited if you're playing on the road against them. It's how you waste opportunities to score on a very vulnerable Michigan secondary. What you do against Michigan is outside leverage plays or downfield attacks. You attack the secondary. You run maybe some outside zone if you want to, like with Henderson. That's why, for example, when Sawyer picked off Michigan and then Ohio State ran that outside zone with Henderson, they got 5 yards because a lot of different teams have players at the skill positions who are faster than many players on Michigan's defense. I mean, Michigan's defense, great up front, but limited at linebacker, and especially at secondary with Will Johnson being out, and they were limited even before he was out. By the way, that makes Michigan's win even more impressive. They won without Colston Loveland and without Will Johnson, and also without Donovan Edwards for much of the game. But anyway, the Buckeyes decide, no, we are not going to use Jeremiah Smith. 0 targets in the second half. We are not going to use Emeka Egbuka. We are not going to use Henderson. We are going to use Quinshon Judkins, who does not have the same breakaway speed and is basically been a power back at Ohio State for his OSU career. We are going to use G. Scott Jr. We are going to use Will Howard. We are going to try to gain inside leverage despite the fact that our All-American center ruptured his Achilles, and our offensive tackles stink, and our guards are not good. And what we're also going to do on defense is get confused when Alex Orji is in the game, when it's obviously a rushing attack. I'm not even an Ohio State fan. I was rooting for Michigan to win yesterday, And I'm getting angry thinking about this because it's ridiculous. It's a waste of talent, a complete waste. It's almost like Ryan Day and Chip Kelly believed that the only way to win was to win the rushing battle. Like, that they had to operate in a box that is as thin and fragile and as small as, like, a CPU chip. Like what my Alienware that I'm recording this on has. It's ridiculous. Like, that's the reason that's a thing is because typically these teams are good and typically they're both physical and they typically operate in a similar way where they like to run the ball. Oh my gosh, it's history. That's all it is. It's history. You can change history. You have the players to change history. It's the same thing with Michigan last year, where they were that good, where they had the players to change history. I mean, they had the best season ever in school history. Ohio State in 2019, same freaking deal. They were projected by every power rating metric to beat LSU because of how dominant they were, and LSU is a GOAT caliber team. You have unlimited talent. You are the most talented team north of the Mason-Dixon line. And I will tell you, until recently, I would have rather had Ohio State's talent than Alabama's or Georgia's in large capacity. Alabama, ever since 2020, after that national title year, perfect example. They never utilized it well. I think some of the scouting was kind of there. Georgia never had the explosive wide receivers or QB play that you did. They just had elite coaches and were dominant in the trenches. You've always recruited as well as Georgia in the trenches until recently, but the development has been very, very off, which makes this game plan that much more ridiculous. That much more ridiculous. Your O-line is, right now, it is one of the worst offensive lines in the Big Ten. It would be even worse if you didn't have receivers, halfbacks, and QBs that could carry this offense into the end zone with their amazing skill position talent. It's ridiculous. That game plan alone should get someone fired. Even if OSU won yesterday, let's say they won 16-13, that game plan should get someone thrown to the curb and locked out of the Woody Hayes facility the following morning. That's disgusting. That's some 2017 level Michigan crap where you're having, John O'Corn throw against an awesome defense, where you're having Michigan run halfback tosses on 3rd and long, and they can't develop a quarterback to save their life, and yet they want to use him. That's some 2020 Michigan garbage, thinking that they can run the same defense 3 or 4 years in a row, even when their recruiting is getting worse, their development is getting worse, and it's the same thing, so everyone can read it now. It's ridiculous. Day cracked under pressure. That's the only explanation for this. I refuse to believe that this is the best Ohio State can do. Refuse to believe it. I do. And the worst thing that Ryan Day could do, the worst thing outside of this, is he made Desmond Howard look like the epitome of intellectual honesty, even though he's the epitome of intellectual dishonesty. Because Desmond Howard's picked Michigan for the previous 4 years in a row, because he always picks Michigan, but he's been right. He's been right, for better or for worse. The other thing too is he's made Urban Meyer look like an immortal god, the same guy that got humiliated by Purdue, that got destroyed by Brian Ferentz, and that completely wasted every ounce of Ohio State talent in terms of winning actual meaningful football games since 2015. That guy is being compared to Nick Saban for whatever reason because Ryan Day can't beat Michigan. It's frustrating. It is. And the reason Day cracked is because he wanted to prove that he was tough. He wanted to commit a ritual. The ritual where Ohio State beats Michigan because they're tougher, because they're more talented, because they're just better, because Michigan can never be better than Ohio State. Michigan is OSU's little brother, and the ritual is Ohio State pounds Michigan every time they play, and there. And we get to talk about how, well, this is what Woody Hayes did, and this is what Jim Tressel and Urban Meyer did, and this is why we hate John Cooper. He's committed to a ritual, to an idea of what he wants OSU football to be, instead of calling it what it is. That's just facts. That's facts. Ryan Day and his staff want OSU to be 2021 Michigan. That's the only explanation. Where you run inside zone, occasionally outside zone, occasionally hit deep shots to keep the defense honest, and you just beat people to death. You fill a sock with concrete and you kill people. You beat them with a baseball bat instead of exhausting them to death like the 2021 OSU offense did. You, in Ryan Day and Justin Fry and Larry Johnson and Mickey Marotti, wanted them to be 2021 Michigan. So enjoy it, because this is 2021 Michigan, where when you meet up with a defense that has an advantage against you in the trenches, like Georgia did, your offense can't do anything. It's helpless. You can't do anything. Can't. And when your defense meets up against an offense that has grit and that is stubborn and that has some competent play caller, like Sharon Moore. I think Sharon Moore was heavily involved in this game plan. You do get moved a bit, and I don't think Jim Knowles should be taking any heat at all. The point is, Michigan was able to run for nearly 200 yards because they were patient, and Ohio State's defensive line, well, is just near elite. It's just great. It's not elite, and the fact that they didn't get pressures and only 3 TFLs is the epitome of that. So is Ryan Day on the hot seat? Is he? Because that loss was bad, but his record is still impressive. Ohio State is still in the playoff. And, well, who would be better? Who would be better? I mean, you can't be one-dimensional and win. And that's on Ryan Day, and that's on the staff. And it's really the culmination, it's the snowball effect of every decision that OSU has made since the 2021 L to Michigan is really what this game was. All of the negative decisions, at least. Like, hiring Jim Knowles was a very positive reaction because Ohio State now has had 2 defenses that statistically are generationally great back-to-back. But I look at Ryan Day, and at one point I say he shouldn't be on the hot seat. Like, his seat should just be warm. And I'm not defending him as much as I used to because that loss was bad. But on the other hand, symbolically, firing him makes sense because this is probably his worst team of his career, and it's also his recent. The trajectory overall has been down. 2022, I think there was a bit of a spike. 23 was a little bit of a decline, but still a team that, if they beat Michigan in that 6-point loss, if Kyle McCord throws 1 fewer pick or no picks at all, they probably win it all and go 15-0 last year. And then this year, I'll tell you right now, this team in its current state would get handled by last year's Ohio State team. It would. Last year's OSU team was tougher. It was better in the trenches. And imagine what 2023 Michigan would do. 2023 Michigan would walk into Ohio Stadium and they would have beaten this team 34-10. It would have not been fun. It would have been boring. It would have been just as entertaining as Michigan versus Rutgers last year. That is how bad this game plan is and how one-dimensional this OSU team is. They cannot run the football, and it's affecting the passing game. I made one of the stupidest statements ever about the game and about college football when I said that Ohio State is the exception to the rule with one-dimensionality. That even if they're one-dimensional, no one can stop their passing attack. Well, that's stupid, because think about it this way. If your defense is elite at stopping the run, but you can't stop the pass, well, look at how successful Texas was on defense last year. Like, you're going to lose a game. You are, because the sample size and the games played are that large enough and offenses are diverse enough to where someone will expose you. This has happened with OSU. They can't run the football, so a certain set of defenses can expose them and can shut down this offense. And every team that has a defensive line or defense that has a build similar to or better than Michigan's have way better offenses. Think of Penn State. Penn State might bully you now if you rematched. Oregon, I have confidence, would kill you on a neutral field. Georgia with their A game could beat you. Texas has figured out to run the football. I'm pretty confident they would beat you because of that. And there's not many other teams, but all of those teams will be in the playoff. I highly doubt all of them will be upset by the Final Four. It's a hard path to make the season anything but a failure because you have to win out. It's truly a natty or bust season right now. And with the one-dimensionality, it's a disaster. And people in Columbus and Ohio State fans and Ryan Day and his staff, they're hurting. And they should be. And honestly, I feel a little bit bad for a lot of those seniors who have not beaten Michigan because I've seen Michigan squads that have never beaten OSU. And it's very painful. But now what I want to move into is specifically talking about Ryan Day's future at Ohio State. And then what we can do is move on and briefly talk about some other games because, wow. What? Just again, I'm kind of at a loss for words again with that game. I am. And this isn't a severe switch of conversation. It's not. But it is in a certain sense because now we're looking more big picture. What I just talked about with OSU is the small picture. It's this year where OSU, and I probably shouldn't have switched over topics too soon because this would have been a great thing to include in the previous video. OSU still can win it all. They're top 4, top 5 in odds to win it all. And because of how down this year is, that makes sense. Like Washington, Oregon, Georgia, Michigan, OSU of last year would smoke all of these teams this year. Outside of maybe Texas, maybe Oregon, maybe Penn State, depending on how they do in the playoff. And even then, all 5 of those teams I'd mentioned, I'd pick to beat all of these teams presently because everyone has issues this year. Everyone, every single team has major issues, not nitpicked issues. Like even 2001 Miami or 95 Nebraska or 19 LSU or 2009 Bama. They had things you could nitpick. All of these teams this year have horrific issues. All of them. Penn State has no receivers. Oregon is not really elite at exactly anything. They're kind of good, great. Oregon's the closest to a complete team, but areas where they lack elite talent, which is in a lot of areas, can come back to bite them. And their trench play on the O-line's worse than it was last year. They don't have the same high-flying offense. Texas can't really run the football, and they did against A&M, but I don't know how good A&M's rushing defense is. I mean, I don't even think A&M's defense is all that good, if I'm being honest. But I digress. We're switching to Ryan Day and talking about him in the long term. After the worst loss, perhaps in program history, where do you stand on Ryan Day? Let me know in the comments section below. And make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and again, comment your thoughts on Ryan Day down in the comment section below. And please click the little notification bell so that you can get notified when I release more college football content, whether it's about Ohio State and Ryan Day or someone else. He has a 66-10 career record, 46-5 in Big Ten Conference play. 4 of those losses are to Michigan. The other one is to the Oregon Ducks. 4 teams, 21, 22, 23 Michigan, and 24 Oregon, that will finish top 5 in FPI and that were close to legitimate national title contenders, outright national title contenders, or in the case of the 2023 Michigan team, a legitimate national champion, like a total national title 15-0 team. The other loss, the 5th, is to the worst Michigan team since the COVID year. If you don't want to count the COVID year, it's the worst Michigan team since Brady Hoke went 5-7 and started a quarterback with a concussion because, well, he was just stupid and that dumb. So no insult to Brady Hoke as a person there. It's just as the coach, as the figure of Hoke. Really dumb, stupid decision, and just a culmination of asinine decisions in 2014. Horrible year. Day is 1-4 against Michigan. He is 2-6 versus FPI top 5 teams. By the way, this is something that that is horrific if you're an Ohio State fan or even a Big Ten defender like myself. Ohio State's the only top 5 team in FPI in the Big Ten. The only one. The others are Texas, and I believe Alabama and Georgia. Yes, and then Notre Dame's at 2. I know Notre Dame at 2 in FPI. I don't know if I don't know if I agree with that. In fact, I don't agree with it, but I digress. I think that Oregon will jump into the top 5 for sure. I think Penn State could, depending on what happens this weekend and in the playoff. Indiana probably not. But again, you never know. The season's been totally chaotic. Everyone in the top 10 of FPI is pretty close to each other. It's the same thing with the top 10 in ESPN's efficiency. But he's 2-6 against FPI top 5 teams, which for now extends from 2019 to 2023. His only wins were against 2020 Clemson, number 3 in FPI that year, and Penn State last year, number 5 in FPI. You look at AP top 5 teams at the top. Ryan Day played him. He is 4-7 against AP top 5 teams. He's 2-1 this year, by the way. So half of his AP top 5 wins have come in this season. But again, a lot of those teams are down compared to the other top 5 teams he's faced in terms of power ratings. Like this year's Indiana team is not as good as last year's Michigan team or the prior Michigan team or maybe even the Michigan team before that in 2021. This Penn State team is not as good as Michigan last year or the year prior. It goes the same with Oregon, I think, and Oregon beat Ohio State this year. So he has won all of the little games except for the one last Saturday, and last Saturday wasn't a little game. In the grand scheme of things, in terms of just treating every football game the same, absolutely it was a little game. In relationship to Ohio State and the Big Ten, that was a big game, even though Michigan's record was 6-5. And yeah, they flunked. That was Ryan Day's worst loss of his career. And 66-10, 46-5, I mean, that's a big reason why you shouldn't want him to be fired. But what I will say before we get to that conversation is that changes must be made no matter what. They win it all this year, they got to make changes, because if they win it all, it's going to be because they're on the side of luck. It's going to be because God loves Ohio State. Not because Ohio State's doing something on its own merit and the divine is just content with what's happening. If that even makes sense. And I don't even know if that's like sound philosophically, but this is a college football channel. The point that I'm trying to make is a lot of things would have to go OSU's way for them to win it all this year. So even if they do, they need to change things. They have to change things this year. Ohio State does. And that's major staff shakeup. Maybe it's Ryan Day and everyone getting fired. Maybe you encourage players to go to the portal, but I think it's more than that. I think you got to encourage some players to go to the portal. But more importantly, because a lot of these players that Ohio State recruits and gets in are talented, what you must do is you got to get better developers of talent. It's like, I don't get why Ohio State fired Perry Alano this preseason. I know he wasn't recruiting well, but Ohio State's issues have never, ever, ever been recruiting. Never. It's been developmental, and that guy's one of the best in the business at developing. Example again, I'm a Michigan fan. I would love it if we hired a Perry Alino, whether as a high-paid analyst or as our next DB coach if we don't keep Lamar Morgan. He's incredible. He developed Sauce Gardner and Kobe Bryant at Cincinnati. And the reason OSU's safeties this year are so good is because of his coaching. It's the same thing as last year. I feel like Ohio State's priorities are not in the right position at all. Some of them absolutely are. That's why they haven't imploded, by the way. Like 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. We're 6 years in. The program hasn't collapsed at all. Like, there are some areas that are shaky, absolutely. But it's not like Day is this terrible, terrible coach. If he were, Ohio State would have probably gone like 8-4 with this schedule, or maybe 7-5 or some other things. He has some good staffers. He has an elite staffer in Brian Hartline. I think Carlos Lachlan is good. I mean, he's not the reason the rushing offense is horrible. Look up front with Justin Fry. Tim Walton thinks a great corner coach. James Laurinaitis is doing a wonderful job with the linebackers. But the recipe is incomplete. And as a result, when you bake your cake, when you make that tasty chicken meal in your pressure cooker, when you open up the oven or the pressure cooker, it stinks. Or at least maybe it doesn't stink, but you think, where's the seasoning? Where's the kick? Where's the juiciness to it? And it just kind of lacks. Changes are necessary. Deep changes are necessary. I think, this is just my opinion, my analysis, I don't think you should fire Day right now. I don't. Because when I think of it here, Dan Lanning not going anywhere. He's at Oregon forever. You may want to hire Curt Cignetti. And if Ohio State does that this year, I will praise them for it. I think that Curt Cignetti at a program like OSU would build not something Saban-esque, but certainly close with OSU's talent and where they are. I think Cignetti right now is a top 10, top 5 head coach. And I've thought that way for a few weeks now. And the OSU game didn't change much of that. It certainly made it clear to me that I overvalued Indiana as a team. It didn't change my opinion on Cignetti at all as a head coach. I mean, he's faced several teams this year that have inferior talent to him, worked basically all of them. Again, outside of OSU, who has superior talent. He's faced several teams with superior talent, and all of them except for OSU, he has worked in a variety of ways. What I think has to happen is OSU is to get a new offensive coordinator. They have to get a new offensive line coach, new D-line coach. They have to get a special teams coordinator, whether that's an analyst who, because of the new rules, is really the special teams coordinator but labeled as an analyst, or you actually get in name a special teams coach. Just do it. Do it. Because the special teams hasn't been good. Like the Caleb Downs punt return for a touchdown was more so because Indiana's special teams sucked in that game rather than Ohio State's being good. And also because Caleb Downs is an epic player who will go down in both Alabama and Buckeye history as being a phenomenal alien. Future NFL first rounder. And he's only a sophomore. And new strength and conditioning. Mickey Marotti, he needs to get out of there. These Urban Meyer holdovers are holding Ryan Day back, ironically enough. The day when Ryan Day, if ever, stops trying to LARP as Urban Meyer or Woody Hayes will be the day that he effectively wins Ohio State the national title, whether on the year of that day or in the future. That's when all of this crap ends, is when he stops trying to LARP as something that he's not. He's not Urban Meyer. He's not Woody Hayes. But I think it's very evident that the record and some of the things he's done, he's not John Cooper either. Maybe in the aspect of against Michigan he is, but he's not losing 4 games or 3 games or, again, outside of Michigan, which rivalry game. There's just... I'm not defending him. I'm not, because I'm not going to say he's this elite coach right now. I'm going to wait on that until I see what's in the playoff. I'm taking that back. I do think his seat should be warm. There needs to be more pressure applied. But, I mean, come on. Come on. He needs to carve out a niche for himself, and he needs to form an identity. Because the frightening thing about Saturday is, you know who Ryan Day and Chip Kelly looked like? They looked like Frosty the Snowman. If you don't know who Frosty the Snowman is, that is my sarcastic and affectionate nickname for Scott Frost. The guy who doused Nebraska in, don't even know if I should be saying this, but he doused Nebraska in alcohol and lit it on fire. That is what Ohio State's offensive coaching looked like. It looked like Scott Frost, where you don't utilize your athletes, implicitly encouraging them to transfer away, and you try to run a stupid spread option with no offensive line. Ridiculous. That right there is Ryan Day either passively or actively trying to be Urban Meyer, trying to be Chip Kelly, trying to be smarter and tougher than everyone else, and it's not working. It's not. And it's Day's fault because he's the CEO, but it's not like this all falls on him individually. Like, from a CEO perspective, yeah, but he's not involved in the offense all that much. He isn't. He delegated responsibilities to Kelly. His O-line coach is Awful. Can't recruit, can't develop. I mean, it's no coincidence that Josh Simmons and Seth McLaughlin are transfers, and Kelly's scheme probably helped them look really, really good. And Simmons' issue was penalties more so than skill play when he came in. And then on the defensive line, Larry Johnson, he's been good. He's a legend in his own right, but I mean, Saban, toward the end of his dynasty, teams were worse. D'Antonio nearly ruined MSU because he was stubborn and wouldn't retire. I mean, at some point, your legends are no longer legends. They are no longer the best. It's time to move on from Larry Johnson. When Jim Knowles sent the house against Michigan a few times, they didn't get any pressure on Davis freaking Warren, on Evan Link, who can't pass block. This Ohio State defensive front did a worse job at getting pressure on Davis Warren than the 2022 defensive front did against Olu Oluwatimi in an elite offensive line and getting pressure on J.J. McCarthy. That was embarrassing. That was terrible. There's just, there needs to be change. Wholesale changes. Whether that is Day being fired, which you may agree with, and I'm not going to argue with that right now. I just think logistically it doesn't make sense. Symbolically, it does. You can't lose to Michigan 4 years in a row. It's why Harbaugh should have been fired at Michigan when he lost to the Buckeyes 4 or 5 years in a row. Symbolically, it makes sense. Logistically, however, I don't think it does. And you don't want Vrabel. And Vrabel probably doesn't want to come back because he's an NFL guy, not because he doesn't like OSU. He obviously likes OSU. Marcus Freeman. You don't want Marcus Freeman. Do you want to beat Michigan, but then lose to Purdue, and then on top of losing to Purdue, get outcoached in a big game that's maybe not Michigan, or lose to Michigan on and off? You don't want that. You don't know how good Freeman is as a coach. I think he's good, but good isn't good enough for you. Good gets you fired at Ohio State. It gets you kicked to the curb. You need elite. You need top 5. And I'm not confident enough to say that Freeman is there, even though I really like what he's done at Notre Dame. I mean, talk about a team that actually wanted to be like Michigan and succeeded. That's Marcus Freeman's Notre Dame right now. They are 2021 Michigan. If 2021 Michigan lost to Rutgers at home, which they nearly did, but beat everyone else. That's what Notre Dame is right now, with that defense and also with that offensive line and rushing attack, which is incredible. But changes have to be made. Strength and conditioning, special teams, the trenches on the O-line, D-line, and a new offensive coordinator. Get someone new, get someone creative. The spread option is dead, at least the one that you want to run. It's dead. It's gone. It's evolved into something new. It shed its skin, and it's become the pro spread, or a pro spread with an option element. Run the modern game. Urban Meyer was a pioneer of the spread, and he adapted when he could. I mean, think about Chris Leak and Tim Tebow. The best coaches don't try to play in a box. It's what held Harbaugh back for years. It's what holds James Franklin back right now. The best coaches adapt to what they have. And Urban Meyer would tell you that with a straight face and would be very mad at you if you disagreed. So, speaking of all of that, let's circle back to the present, to the here and now, and for the next few months. With Ryan Day, and with what we have on staff, and also the players too, think about it. Is there hope in the CFP? Is there a chance Ohio State wins it all? And I ask that because if Ohio State wins it all, there should be no calls for him to be fired. If he wins it all, I will say the loss to Michigan is humiliating, but I will also say at the same time the seat's totally cold. You win a national title, you should never be fired. I mean, if he even reaches the national title game, I would question whether or not he should be fired. Reach the Final Four? But again, it doesn't logistically make sense in my opinion. That's just my opinion. Let me know. Tell me in the comment section below what you think. I think there's hope. I think that Ohio State's better than the majority of the teams who will make it in the playoff. I think they're better than Tennessee. They're better than Alabama. They're better than South Carolina. They're better than Miami. They're better than anyone in the ACC, even though SMU's ranked ahead of them for some reason in the coaches poll. They're better than a lot of teams in the SEC. I think the only teams right now that are definitively better than OSU by a slim but obvious margin or by a wide margin are Oregon, Texas, and Penn State. That's it. And yes, you beat Penn State, but Ohio State's gotten progressively worse as the season's gone on, and that McLaughlin injury made it so that you can't run up the middle anymore. You could occasionally, even without Simmons. You can't anymore without McLaughlin. That's been very, very apparent. And I also think because of the limitations there, Howard's gotten worse because it's obvious that Ohio State's only success is going to be passing the football. So it's easier for defenses to guard against your offense. And Penn State's D-line would manhandle that offensive line right now. Same thing with Texas with Alfred Collins and Oregon too with Derek Harmon. But that's really it. I still think you're better than Indiana. I mean, heck, this exact team crushed Indiana. And yeah, Indiana made some flukish plays, but on a different day, at best for IU, it's maybe 27-20 Ohio State, maybe 24-21 or 24-20, 24-17 on a neutral field. I mean, Ohio State's still a really good, great, maybe near elite team. The reason there's frustration, and the frustration's deserved, is because Ohio State's not beating their biggest rival. They just lost in a very humiliating fashion, and they're not elite. And because of that loss that was very humiliating, James Franklin is going to Indy, and Ryan Day is not. And now James Franklin and Ryan Day kind of look like the same guy, except Day can recruit better and has a better program, so therefore he is better. Not saying they're the same guy, by the way. I think Day's a way better game manager than Franklin, but that's more so anecdotal and of personal opinion than anything else at this point. The O-line issues is what holds OSU back. If OSU can find a way to be creative in the run game, like using pole blocking techniques, which worked briefly against Michigan, or if they can find a way to be very involved in the passing attack and be tactical so that nothing gets repetitive, and the defense continues to play this way and is healthy, they can win it all. But that's asking a lot, especially from the offensive line and from an offense that is, at this point, way more predictable than it was early in the year. Another thing to keep in mind is that OSU has played a tough schedule, and therefore they've gotten worn down. They've gotten battered up. They've played more snaps. The starters have, at least. They're not as well rested as Oregon is or as Penn State. This also comes into conversation because OSU kind of had an early second bye. Oregon was coming off of their bye yesterday against Washington. So they're not as well rested as many other teams in the playoff, and they have some of the worst trench play in the playoff. Like Texas, Oregon, Penn State have both better O-lines, and Texas and Penn State, I think, have better D-lines than OSU does. Derek Harmon is a better defensive lineman than anyone OSU has, in my opinion. I think that a team like Georgia, when healthy, is better in the trenches than OSU is. And there are probably some other teams that I may be forgetting, like South Carolina. South Carolina is a better defensive line. Tennessee has a better rushing attack, better offensive line right now. The SMU, it's so hard to compare those teams because they're completely different schedules and different level of talent. But SMU's fundamentally sound, good in the trenches. So, I mean, I'll probably make another video on this, talking about this. Because Ohio State's not playing for a conference championship, so therefore I have time to talk about them in a sense of how can they do in the playoffs. But the O-line issues are a huge hurdle to overcome, and really the conclusion of all of this is just they need to figure it out, and the time is now, and the time is right after their playoff run, whether they exit in the first round, whether they go 2-1, or whether they win it all. Right after their playoff run ends. They need to figure it out sometime in between now and then. And preferably Ryan Day should do some figuring out now in pencil, where you look at the staffers who want to fire, the ones who want to get in contact with, and figure it out, because this is not acceptable. This is not good. And because of that loss to Michigan yesterday, it changed a lot. I thought Ohio State was going to be a lock to win the conference next year, even though they were losing a ton because of their talent, because their coaches. They weren't going to play Oregon. Oregon was losing a lot, and I think losing a lot at more important positions relative to Oregon's roster and how they're built. This loss changed everything, because it's abundantly clear Ryan Day can't beat Michigan. And even if Sharon Moore's not the guy at Michigan, Michigan will probably be better next year than they are this year, and they have home field advantage. And Penn State returns a lot of key players next year too. And Ryan Day plays Texas in week 1. next year, and Sark has that program on the rise. So a lot has changed, even if it doesn't feel like it. And Ohio State fans do have a right to freak out. So, yeah, Ryan Day and Ohio State need to figure it out. And that's that. That's that conversation right there. And I told you we'd spend a lot of time talking about this. I mean, look, we're an hour into the show, and all we've talked about is the game. All we've talked about. But we do have some more things that I want to get to, that I definitely think we have some time to get to. So let's do that and then get on out of here. And Chimichanga Guy, I did not see the video that you sent on X, but I will try my best to do so. But let's continue with this and talk about the fact that, well, because of Ohio State's loss, James Franklin, guess where he goes? He goes to Indianapolis. Congratulations, James Franklin. Anyway, Penn State punches their ticket to Indianapolis with a 44-7 dominant game-controlling win over the Maryland Terrapins. You want to know why Penn State won, how they won? I mean, it's pretty simple. They were a huge favorite to win over Maryland anyway. But they won because they didn't let Maryland do anything offensively. Gain any yards, create any sustainable drives, even score outside of the first play of the game where Maryland recovered a Nicholas Singleton fumble on the kickoff, or maybe it was on the first drive for Penn State. I don't exactly know or remember. And then 25-yard pass to Caden Prather. Yep, it was the first play. 1st and 25. Singleton ran it, fumbled, got stuffed at the line. Maryland was able to create some TFLs and some penetration in the trenches against Penn State. But Penn State ultimately is so good on the O-line, even without Don Coe, and really good on the D-line to the point where they can kill you in the trenches. If they call the game right, if they bow up and don't break on defense, and if they have time to figure some things out, they will kill you offensively. They will assassinate you. That's the gift of having elite position coaches and of having an OC like Andy Kotelnicki. Penn State had 412 total yards, over 200 rushing yards, close to 200 passing yards. Maryland was up 7-0 after, 14 seconds in the first quarter. At the end of the first quarter, it was 7-3 Maryland. At halftime, it was 31-7 Penn State. They poured it on. They completely poured it on. The one play where I think it was 10-7 Penn State, maybe 17-7 Penn State, where Maryland, 4th and inches at their own 31, 32, 30, they run shotgun, and whether it's Abdul Carter, Devon J. Thomas, Denai Dennis Sutton, or maybe a linebacker like Tony Roas, they just stuff it casually. I mean, what are you doing in shotgun? What are you doing 4th and inches shotgun? Just QB sneak it. Don't overthink it, Mike Loxley. But Penn State got the stop there, and at that point I'm like, yeah, this is a blowout. This game's over, which is the case with every Penn State-Maryland interaction ever outside of the sanctions era. Franklin really has a bone to pick with Maryland. The backstory on that is he was going to be the head coach in waiting. The administrative types didn't like that. They messed that up. And there's also the fact that, you know, they recruit in the Maryland area, the DMV, so they want to stick it to Maryland so that they can tell the recruits, like, hey, don't go to the Maryland bums, come up here to the Penn State greats. Not saying Maryland's a bum school, by the way, but they are in a very bad and low position that we'll talk about here in a few seconds. Penn State only allowed 194 total yards, and they forced 3 turnovers. They also forced on Maryland's defense 219 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns, and averaged over 4 yards per carry. Just total dominance by the Nittany Lions, by Penn State, and Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, even some backup running backs got involved, like Corey Smith, for example. Aller had a rushing touchdown. Perbula had a rushing touchdown. Warren had 32 rushing yards, also had 68 receiving yards and a touchdown. Tyler Warren, end of the season, 978 receiving yards, and because Penn State's going to Indy, he's going to finish the regular season probably with over 1,000 receiving yards, and he already has well over 1,000 total yards. In fact, over 1,100 total yards and 10 total touchdowns. Easily the nation's best tight end, Tyler Warren is. He was involved in this game. Amari Evans, many of these other players were involved for the Penn State Nittany Lions. So Penn State dominated up front, they had more total rushing yards than Maryland had total yards, which is very impressive. What Penn State did in this game is they showed off their elite trench play. They allowed no sacks, 8 TFLs, which is not necessarily encouraging, but no sacks, and they had 219 rushing yards. They averaged 4.5 yards per carry. They had 4 rushing touchdowns. And, well, they forced 6 sacks. Abdul Carter, man, 10 sacks on the season. All-American caliber defensive end. It's his first year in a new position. He was originally recruited to DN, by the way, but wanted to play linebacker. Then this year changed his mind, wanted to play DN, wanted to help out the team, knowing there was a drop-off in production there. He's been phenomenal. He's just team player, awesome. This defensive line is one of the best D lines in the country. They don't have the same interior presence that Michigan does, but I think their exterior presence is second to none, or at least maybe second, third, certainly top 3 in the country. Penn State's trench play reminds me a lot of the trench play of the previous Michigan teams that won Big Ten championships. It's similar with, Oregon, who we'll talk about later in this stream. But I was impressed with Penn State and what they've been able to do this year, what they also did to close out the regular season after playing Minnesota close, after being on the road back-to-back. Could have been a look-ahead spot because it's Maryland, and I've seen James Franklin pull out starters and rest them before because they want to rest players, prepare for the postseason. They did that in 2019 against Rutgers, by the way. They didn't do that, though. They did at the end, but that's because they were already up 38-7. They can win the Big Ten, and believe me when I say they can bring home a national title as well, because they have NFL players at running back, tight end, on the O-line, on the D-line, at linebacker. They also have them at defensive back, and they have elite position coaches like Deion Barnes on the defensive line, Terry Smith in the secondary, Jajon Sider at running backs, or Ty Howell at tight end. Phil Trotween has produced 2 good offensive lines in a row, someone I initially criticized, but it's obvious that he is a much better offensive line coach than Penn State's previous offensive line coaches. He's produced the best offensive lines that James Franklin's ever had at Penn State. Tom Allen, his second half defenses are elite, kind of like Jesse Minter's second half defenses in 2022. And you also look at Andy Kotelnicki, and Kotelnicki has made this Penn State offense top 10 in ESPN's efficiency. They're sitting at 6th right now. Scoring-wise, they're not up there, but they have a very high success rate, and this offense has been getting better on an average basis week in, week out. I mean, the Ohio State game was bad. It was. But that could have easily been a 27-20 Penn State win, or 20-20 and it goes into overtime, and we think a little bit differently of the potential of this offense. Again, a bad loss. Penn State's very fortunate that OSU lost to Michigan, so they can be in Indianapolis. But it's also a credit to Penn State because they didn't lose to a bad team. They didn't, like Ohio State did. They did not lose to a bad team. They played it close with Minnesota and USC on the road, who are comparable to, or probably a little bit better than Michigan, but they beat those teams. Ohio State didn't beat a team who they should have easily beaten. And that's a credit to Penn State, and that has a lot to do, actually, with Penn State's assistant coaches. Penn State does the little things better than Ohio State does, but they don't do the big things as well, largely because of a talent gap, and also without an X-factor receiver, it's hard to make big plays. It's hard to be explosive, to stretch opposing defenses. But yeah, this is a good team. They can win the Big Ten, and they can win it all this year. Make no mistake about that. Last but not least, very quickly, I think Mike Locksley's seat should be scorching hot. Everyone talked about how Maryland was going to benefit from no longer having divisions and no longer having to play Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Michigan State every year. I guess insert diarrhea noises here, or whatever you want to think of that's like a funny way of humiliating Maryland. They finished 4-8, 1-8 in conference play. They lost to Michigan State at home. They got destroyed by a Rutgers team who was kind of disappointing in their own right and riddled with injuries. Annihilated by Penn State. Casually killed. Oregon didn't even try to crush Maryland, and they did. And I could go on and on and on. Oh, also, They got 4 turnovers against Indiana, so they played Indiana in one of Indiana's worst games of the year. Indiana still killed them. And there's other losses, too, that I'm not even, talking about. Not a good team. Not well coached. Not well developed. They finished 4-8, and I think Loxley's seat should be hot. I think Maryland, as a job, does have some potential. So I think the time to move on from him, if you don't think that he is the right fit, is now and not next year. Because next year, maybe that LSU job comes open, or maybe the USC job comes open. Maryland right now is an opportunity to be one of the better jobs in the country. So I think the doors there should open. Don't know if they will, though, because I'm not an insider with any of this stuff. Iowa snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Nebraska snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Things stay the same, even in all the chaos. There's nothing new under the sun, or however that saying goes. Iowa beat Nebraska 13-10 in a game that, look, the Cornhuskers, they were statistically the better team. They looked like the better team. They had 334 total yards to Iowa's 164. They had 2 turnovers. Iowa had none, but still that huge yardage differential should still favor the Huskers even with those turnovers. They had 20 first downs to Iowa's 5. And 30, I'm going to get mad like I did Ohio State, Michigan. 39 minutes of possession. And you tell me that this team lost? What are we doing? What are we doing, Matt Rule? That's the question of the week. The only reason people aren't making fun of Matt Rule or questioning him more is because of what Ryan Day did. And here's the good news if you're a Nebraska fan. Nebraska's 6-6, 3-6, and they're better than they were last year. It may not feel like it because of how the defense has gotten exposed at times, but outside of Michigan last year, you never played a competent offense. I mean, even Colorado's offense last year was pretty incompetent. This season, Colorado's offense was better. You destroyed them. Iowa's offense was competent for the most part of this season. You shut them down in this game. You limited USC's offense. You shut down Ohio State's offense before the McLaughlin injury. And yeah, I mean, Indiana boat raced you, but Indiana's been boat racing every team with comparable talent. And they were at home, and they had an extra week to prepare. And I mean, Illinois had a way better offense than they did last year. So you faced better offenses this year compared to last year in the aggregate. That's probably why the defense dropped off. It's a similar story with Iowa, too, if we're being honest. I mean, Iowa's defense returned a ton. Last year they did have some issues just because of the talent they have, and it's hard to have a perfect unit. But they faced some better offenses this year with some better athleticism than they did last year, and they got exposed. They did, but not here. Iowa won 13-10, despite the fact that Nebraska had over 300 offensive yards. Nebraska only scored 10 points. Here's an impact statistic. If I tell you this statistic, you know that Iowa wins. Iowa forced 5 fumbles, and they recovered 2. Now, that's not an impressive recovery percentage, but the fact they forced 5 fumbles implies that they're probably getting pressure on the quarterback, because running backs don't fumble that much. And then they recovered 2 of them. So they probably win the turnover battle because Iowa doesn't throw the ball that much and they certainly don't fumble. And I give you this too. The fact that they hold Nebraska to 334 yards and 4.4 yards per play, and on top of that, they're turning it over that much, that means Nebraska probably doesn't score all that many points. And if you want to beat Iowa, you kind of have to score in the 20s. You can't score in the teens because Iowa finds ways, whether with turnovers or now that they have an offense, you get a long Caleb Johnson run, or in this game it was a halfback pass, which is particularly humiliating. They find ways to hit. They find ways to hit the 20s now, or at least the upper teens. So you have to get in the 20s to ensure win, especially with it being on the road in an environment like this. I tell you this before the game. And if you're betting on Nebraska, you're probably tempted to sell you're probably tempted to sell or cancel your bets and kind of hammer Iowa. Turns out that's not what happened, because then I would also tell you Iowa only had 5 first downs. Then you probably think Nebraska wins. Whoops. That's not what happened, because this game was a lot like what happened the following day with Ohio State versus Michigan. It was insane. It was crazy to watch. I mean, Iowa used special teams and defense to win. That's no surprise there. 2 of 2 on field goals, 9 punts for 364 yards, 40.4 yards per punt, and they had 4 sacks and 8 TFLs. I mean, you look at the data here. Iowa had 40.4 yards per punt. Nebraska had 34.9 yards per punt. Nebraska had 1 punt return for no yards. Iowa had 1 punt return for 25 yards. So the hidden yardage benefited Iowa. Nebraska had to go on longer drives. Iowa had shorter drives. I mean, 2 of their field goals were made on drives where they gained like an average of 1 yard per drive, and they got 2 field goals off of that. That's how good Iowa's field position was. Iowa had 2 kick returns for 56 yards, average of 28 yards per return. Nebraska had 2 for only 36, though, average of 18. So again, hidden yardage benefited Iowa. Special teams benefited Iowa. And those 4 sacks, those 8 TFLs, they were getting pressure. When Nebraska ran the football, they often got a push. But when Nebraska had to pass block, that's where the issues began to arise, especially as the game went on. And I think Phil Parker was better able to figure out this Iowa offense. The great defensive coordinators, the great defensive minds, or defenses that at least have decent minds, like okay minds, but elite players. Defenses with those combinations, they get better as the game goes on, even when they're on the field for 40 minutes. And Iowa's defense was on the field for 40 minutes. But they won because their defense is that good. They're deep. They made penalties that were intelligent penalties. Like when their guys were beat, they just dragged down those Nebraska receivers because we're not letting you score a touchdown. And Nebraska only scored 1 touchdown, a rushing touchdown. Even with those receivers who made some big plays or had the opportunity to make some big plays but didn't, Iowa never let them score a passing touchdown. Didn't do it. What was not surprising, was confused as to what section I want to talk about. We'll get into that in a few, which was a bit surprising. Kirk Ferentz, I want to get to this very quickly, very briefly. He's a conflicted legend, and I think a game like this shows that. You imagine, on one hand, what they would be with a good offense, and you think to yourself, this guy's a failure. But on the other hand, these wins are epic because they shouldn't be possible, and yet they're happening. Think of last year, 13-10 Iowa. Iowa missed a bunch of field goals. Iowa let a deep passing touchdown happen on their secondary. They won because they picked off Nebraska in Nebraska's territory. Their backup running back ran for 20 yards to center the field goal, and their backup kicker kicked the field goal to win. That's legend-type stuff. Think of last year. If Cooper DeJean, if that call against Minnesota is changed and he returns that punt for a touchdown, that's a legendary win that if you're an Iowa fan, you'll forever remember. If you're a Minnesota fan, you'll forever remember as well in a negative way. Same thing with the Michigan State game last year. Michigan State had an extra 100 yards, but Iowa forced like 5 turnovers and had a punt return for a touchdown that broke the game open. That's legend stuff. Think of 2017 against Ohio State where they just, like Brian Ferentz of all people, blows OSU out of the water. Legend stuff. Think about 2002 where they lose to Iowa State at home, but are 11-1, and they go to the Rose Bowl, and depending on what happened in that final week of the regular season, they were in the national title, the BCS national title conversation. Legendary stuff to do that at Iowa. So he has a conflicted legacy, of course, with, imagine what he did on offense. He's a very stubborn guy, very conservative guy schematically, and he's not adapted the program. He's not kept it in the best shape, in my opinion. But also, a lot of these things that he's doing are, from a standpoint of winning football, just admirable and epic. And I think the Hawkeye program consequentially is in a good place. I mean, think of Caleb Johnson, and what was shocking about this game was the fact that one of Iowa's first downs came on what was a 72-yard touchdown reception on a pass that was probably meant to go only 5 to 10 yards. Caleb Johnson just kept trucking through his tacklers, broke them, had breakaway speed and acceleration, and you saw it on the camera. You saw you saw the whole stadium erupt. I mean, the camera was shaking. Effort, 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 effort. That right there, that is the epitome of Iowa football and the mentality that they have. So this program, I think, for Iowa is in a good place. The team for Nebraska, however, is still in a rebuilding phase. They went 6-6, could have gone 8-4, 9-3 if things went differently. They also could have gone 5-7 if things went differently too. So the fact they're going to a bowl game is good, and they did it with a freshman quarterback and some new pieces, a coaching change in the middle of the season. So I think that I don't know what to think. I think the season's a little bit of a disappointment because they only went 6-6 after 5-7, but they're still going to a bowl game, so there is some improvement for the Cornhuskers. You look at Nebraska and Matt Rule. I think one of their bigger weaknesses is that they're coordinator dependent. I think that's something that's very clear with Nebraska, with Matt Rule, is Rule's just coordinator dependent. After this year, I've kind of likened him to what a Nebraska version of James Franklin would be like. He's not good at managing games, and his decision-making is a little bit questionable. I mean, they've been inconsistent all year. Sometimes they come out on fire. Other times they come out flat. That's a culture issue. Schematically, there's sometimes, one game with Marcus Satterfield, they're running a bunch of screens. The other game, they abandon it completely. One game with Dana Holgorsen, like they look very physical and dominant offense against Wisconsin at home. Against Iowa, they completely fold up in the second half and call some questionable plays there. I think he's coordinator dependent, and it's not a good thing, but it's a thing that can be negated a little bit if you hire the right guys. I think Tony White's a good DC. I think Dana Holgorsen's a good OC. Are they great? I think that's yet to be seen, and I think there probably do need to be more, changes to the staff, especially at the wide receiver coach position and maybe some other places. And they need to recruit better, and they are, which is good. And they probably need to use the portal more heavily than they did the last time around, and I think they will. But in this game, it became pretty clear to me that Rule is coordinator dependent. He is. So that's something that I wanted to point out here and talk about as well, because they're inconsistent, and that falls on the head coach. And it's not just coaching staff or decisions, it's also players and execution and these different things. So that's that. The defense, though, to finish off on a positive note, they played their hearts out. Tony White, I think he's here to stay. Maybe he will get a head coaching opportunity, but that's not something that I can determine or you can determine. That's something that depends on largely circumstances and the dominoes falling. Iowa was held to 49, I almost said 99 because it's so unbelievable, 49 rushing yards and 1.9 yards per carry, and 115 passing yards and 7.7 yards per attempt. And 72 of those came on one play. And that wasn't due to schematics, that was due to tackling, that was due to effort. And that was a superhuman play by Caleb Johnson. A little disappointing by Nebraska, but that type of stuff falls on the head coach or the strength and conditioning coach, where you just get outpowered like that, or you don't give that type of effort. That does not fall on Tony White there. They played their hearts out. It's the same thing with OSU. This loss falls on the CEO and the offense. It does not fall on the defense. They played their hearts out. The Black Shirts did, and they deserve to be called the Black Shirts now. This is another good defense. Frustrating at times, yeah, but they're good. They're great. They did their job against Iowa. They saw limited offense, and they attacked it. It was ultimately their own offense and offensive line and also special teams that let them down in this game. I wanted to get to some more things tonight, but it's an hour 30 minutes, and I think that I think that we have gone on for long enough. Really what it is that I told a friend that I would be meeting up with him at 7. It's 7 right now, and I still have a few more things to get through because we, went a little bit long. But what I will do is probably tonight, tonight or tomorrow, I will finish out segments and get them up tomorrow. Just a little, as like little reaction videos. They'll be pretty short, like the Penn State Maryland one, like no longer than 10 minutes per segment. So thank you very much, guys, for coming on. I do see there is a super chat. I will screenshot that. I will save it, and I will answer it in my question and answer section, which will be either this Thursday or this Friday. Thank you guys very much for coming on. Make sure to like, hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. I appreciate the 35 likes, 100 concurrent viewers for much of this video. I appreciate all of these comments, the activity in the chat. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it, and I will see you all very soon. Have a great day, and bye-bye.